So let's look at question number 13. If you need to import data via data loader with created date as a past date, how would you do it? Alright, so the very next question is, how do you insert or import records through the data loader if you want to keep the created date in the past, right? So we know normally that Salesforce does not allow modifying, the audit fields like last modified date, created date, and all these timestamps. But there's a way to do it when you are trying to import data. Yes. So there's a permission that needs to be enabled for this. I'm on the setup page, and on the home and the quick find box, I will simply type user interface, right? And if you see this user interface option coming up, this has a user interface option available down here. Let's click here and let's search for something called audit fields. This right here. So you see this permission enables set audit fields upon record creation and update records with inactive owners user permission. This is that permission that we need to enable, and once this is enabled on the org level, what you also need to do is you need to enable this on the user or on the user level, basically either via profile or your permission set. So let's enable this right here. And now let's go to profiles. So I'll just open the system administrator profile. Let's click on edit and let's search for audit fields. So you see this permission right here, this has to be checked. Set audit fields upon record creation is something that we'll have to enable. We can go to permission set and create a new permission set for it. So I'll just create a new permission set. I'll call it modify audit fields when importing, right? Let's provide the license of Salesforce here. Let's click on save. Let's search for our setting, which is audit fields. Set audit fields upon record creation comes under system permissions. So this permission right here, right? Let's try to enable it from permission set. I'm hoping this will be allowed, and then we can assign the permission set to as many users as we want. Yeah, so I'm able to enable it, right? And this says that you can set audit fields such as created by and last modified by when you create a record via API only. That means even though the permission is enabled, if you look into a record in the Salesforce org, you'd still not able to modify the timestamps or the audit fields. But if you're importing data with some API or some kind of a import tool like data loader per se, you will be able to enter data for audit fields as well, and that will be stamped on your corresponding audit fields. All right, cool. Let's move on to the next question. All right, so the next question is, based on a value selected on a pick list, you need to show or hide a quick action in Lightning. How would you achieve it? Question talks about how can you show or hide a quick action based on a certain value on a particular field for a record, right? So let's say for an example, I want to show the delete button on the account record detail page only if the annual revenue is less than 50,000, right? How do we achieve that? So let's quickly go to a account record in the system. Let's just open up accounts tab and let's look into this record, right? SF training here. So if I open this record, we have some quick actions available here, right? And among these we have several others, and among which the use case that we are trying to consider is I don't want to show the delete button if the annual revenue of this particular account is more than 50,000, right? This field right here. So if I enter 55,000 here, which is probably my annual revenue, and I save it, then this delete button should be hidden. All right. Right, so to achieve this, we have something called dynamic actions that Salesforce has recently released, right? So this page that we see is a Lightning record page, and if I quickly click on the setup button here, you see an option to edit page, right? Let's click on this edit page button. So the changes that you want to make in terms of dynamic actions or anything on the record page, you'll have to modify the Lightning record page, which is the account record page for our current use case, right? So if I click on this highlights panel right here, right, you see some option coming up to upgrade to dynamic actions. This says you can now configure dynamic actions for the highlights panel in the Lightning app builder. The actions will be enabled for desktop. So this is available for desktop, and let me just click on upgrade now, right? And I'll just choose new actions, or I'll just start with the actions which are currently available here, right? So let's click on the first option, migrate, and click on next. And this is something we are doing for the account layout, so let's select this layout for now. This is the source for our dynamic actions, and the actions that are available on the account layout will be migrated into this dynamic actions option. So once we upgrade it, you see all my actions that are available come as a list here, right? And now which is that action that we want to consider? It's the delete action, right? So if I click on the delete button here, you see I can add a filter, which is a pretty cool, pretty amazing thing, right? You can define the visibility of an action dynamically using some field value. Now how do I achieve that? I'll just click on add filter, and I'll just say the field annual revenue. Let me just find out where annual revenue is, right here. If annual revenue is less than 50,000, right? So this says that the action will be visible only when records annual revenue is less than 50,000, right? So let's click on done, and let's click on save. Now once we click on save, we also need to activate this page. Now activation basically means what kind of org, what kind of application, what kind of record types, and what kind of profiles need to have visibility. So we can either set it on the basic level, either assign some applications, record types, and profiles, or if we are super sure that this particular application will be using this record page, we can assign it here, or if our entire org is using the same page, we can assign as org default. All right, and let's set it for desktop, and let's click on next. So for desktop, the system default current org, the account record page will be assigned, right? This is the assignment. Let's click on save. So now we have modified our record page, and we have also saved it. Now what we can do is we can just go click the back button and see our records and see if this thing is working. So now we are on the account record, and let's see if we are able to see the delete button or not. So if I check my details section, so you see the delete button is hidden now, right? Now as soon as I modify my annual revenue and make this something less than $50,000, I'll just click on save, and my delete button should pop up. See, it's coming up right here, right? So these are dynamic actions, and this is how you'd probably show and hide quick actions on your highlights panel based on user value. So far so good? Cool. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 15. There's a code snippet in the future method which is written as part of the trigger. How can this be avoided if batch apex is used to insert bulk records? So while developing triggers, there might be a need to invoke a future method from the trigger to do certain things asynchronously. In such instances, developers should make sure this invocation is not made if the current context is already asynchronous, which is either future or batch. Now, if an account record, for example, is inserted through a batch process and through another future method, there's an exception that is being thrown. So we need to develop a workaround which can ensure that the code does not invoke the asynchronous method. Now there are two ways to go about it. Either we can use system.isFuture and system.isBatch to ensure the future method call is only made for asynchronous apex. The code would look something like this. And the other option would be to modify the future method itself. Instead of future annotation, we can use the queuable apex. Now since queuable apex change jobs one after the another, the solution will eliminate the issue of future methods being called from batch. Let's look at question number 16. Can you write a sockle to count related contacts for an account record? First of all, let's create some records. So we already have the account record SF training created. And now let's create some contacts. Alright, so I have two contacts created under the account SF training, right? And now we want to count via Apex how many related contacts are associated for a single account. So let's jump into developer console and create a new Apex class. I'll name it count related contacts. So let's create a method here. And I'll name it count related records or count related contacts, right? And we'll be taking a one parameter which would be obviously our account ID. So let's take the account ID instead. All right, now we want to do a related query through which we can get the number of contacts associated to a single account. So there are two ways to go about it. Let's look at option number one. So here we'll be using something called as an inner query. So let's query the account record. So I can use inner query, something like this: select ID from contact. Alright, I'll add the where clause filter where ID equal to the account ID that's being passed to the method. And if I can just debug this, I can say account.contacts.size. This would give me the number of contact records associated to this single account. Let's save this. So there's some error that's coming up. Let's look at what it is. Alright, so the relationship name is contacts. It's not contact because we have multiple contacts under a single account. Yeah, this saves pretty much fine. Let's execute anonymous apex from here now, and let's say count related contacts dot count related contacts method, and let's pass the record ID of SF training just for testing purpose. I'll just pass this record ID from here, and let's say open log and click on execute. So it says invalid ID. Okay, I added a space, my bad. Let's execute this now. So this has run successfully and is opening up the log. Let's select the debug only option, and let's see. Yeah, so related contacts are 2, which means our query is working just about fine. Right, now let's look at option number 2. So the second option is using aggregate results. Salesforce provides something called the aggregate result class, right? And we can query our aggregations into this particular class. So how would I do it? I'll type select account ID, comma, count of IDs from contact, where account ID is equal to the ID that's provided by the method, group by account ID, right? So this should give me the total count for each account ID on the contact level. And this aggregation is stored in the aggregate result class. So let me just define a variable here and call it contact count, and let's add a debug log. And this should be contact count dot. So I need a field to point out here, right? So we want to check the count of IDs, correct? So what we can do is we can use something called aliasing. So count ID can be renamed as something called total count, and I'll be using this alias name to fetch my count information. Let's try to save this. So this saves, but it's giving an error, right? So I think I won't be able to use the dot operator directly. Let me try to use the get operator. So since this is an instance of an object, this might work using the get instance. So let's try to write contact count, which is my aggregate result instance dot get, and I'm providing the key. This should provide me the count value from this particular query. Right, this saves up fine, and now let's execute the same code and let's see how both the debug logs are coming up. Let's click on debug only, and yeah, related options via option 1 are 2, and same is for the second option also, which means both ways are fine and both ways it's working fine. Let's recap what we did. In the first option, we used a simple inner query. We queried the account record and we did an inner query saying select ID from contacts. This account holds all the related contacts along with it for this particular record ID in concern, and what we used in the debug statement was the account.contacts.size. Right, this gave me the result. The second option what we used was using an aggregate result method. So instead of writing a plain query, we use some aggregate methods. For here we used count because our use case was to count the total number of contact records for an associated account, and we queried the contact record here. And for this count ID, since we wanted to fetch this when we tried to retrieve it using the get method, we use something called aliasing, and that is something we can do only with aggregate results, right? So what we did is we created a count ID and we grouped our information using account ID, and we also added a filter so that the results are only for the ID that we are looking in for concern, right? So both these methods work fine, and my personal preference would be the second option, because this allows you to query on the contact level directly, and your aggregate functions are for this, right? To count related information and to do aggregate results, summation, or so this is how we can count related contacts for an account. Let's look at the next question. Question number 17. How would you populate a map using Sockle? Map using sockles is a pretty straightforward thing. So we normally use in Apex when we want to directly use maps and use that map for further evaluations or calculations. So let's quickly create a new Apex class for this question. I'll name it sockle map populator. I'll also create a method, static void populate map via sockle, right? So let's write a normal sockle first. So let's say we want to query contact information. Let's say we want to take in some 10 records. All right, I'll just query two attributes, id comma name. Now what we can simply do is, instead of initializing or associating this with a list of contact, we can associate this with a map. And how do we associate it? We can associate it using map of id comma object name or map of string comma object name. So map of id comma, in our case the object name is contact, right? I'll just call it contact map. And this should do it. That's all you need. Let's try to save this. Yep, it saves pretty much fine. Now just to check, let's iterate over our records. So contact map dot key set. Let's add a debug statement. Cool. So our debug statement should list out all the record IDs and the names of the contacts. Let's try to execute this on the anonymous Apex window. So if we have 10 records in the system, this should give me a list of 10, but let's see what comes up. So this executed successfully. Let's click on the debug only window, and yeah, so you see we are getting record ID and contact name, right? Let me just quickly check. So contact name dot get contact ID is not giving me the contact name per se, it's giving me the entire contact record, right? Because we have the value as a contact record. So if you see, it's not just the name, it's your entire contact information. All right, cool. Let's move on to the next question. So question number 18. If you are using a wrapper class and one of the fields is not Aura enabled, will that be accessible on the client side Lightning controller? If we have a wrapper or something on the Apex created that we are trying to send it back to the client side controller and it is not Aura enabled or not annotated with Aura enabled, will that be accessible on the JavaScript side or the Lightning controller side? Let's check that out. So I'll just open an existing component that we used for some other use case. Let's see if I have it. Yeah, navigate to URL component, right? Let's open this app and let's open this component. Right, so I would want to add a controller here, and before adding the controller, let's create one. I'll create an Apex class and I'll call it navigate to URL controller, right? Let's copy this, let's click on OK. So my Apex class is created. Let me add that controller on my Lightning component and save it. So my component is saved, and I also want to write the init method, right? So I'll declare an aura handler. Let's save this. Okay, there's some issue with the declaration. Name equal to init should be fine. Name action type, this should be pretty much it. I think this should not be value, this should be value, not type. Let's check with value. Yeah, so the aura handler looks fine now, and we have associated a controller. Now in this controller, I want to create a wrapper. First of all, I'll name it default wrapper, and I'll create two variables, string name and string check. I'll just name this check, but I'll keep this as a boolean data type. All right, and now let's annotate both of them with aura enabled. Right, this is our use case. Let's annotate both of them with aura enabled. Let's save it again. Right, this is saved, and now let me create a method that I'll be calling from my lightning controller. I'll name it public static void fetch wrapper values. Right, let's name it fetch wrapper values, and all I'll be doing is I'll create a new wrapper, and I'll initialize those values. dw dot name is equal to sf training, dw dot check is equal to false. All right, and I'll just return this wrapper. A very straightforward operation I've done on the Apex side. Let's just save this. Okay, so there are some errors. Okay, I think there's a typo here. This should be wrapper, Control S. Okay, this cannot be void. This has to have a return type, right? Because we are returning something. My bad. I'll just save it as default wrapper. Now let's check what else. There's a typo here. This should not be a dot. Let's click on save now. I think this should save up fine now. Yeah, so my controller is ready. Now let's head back to our component, and let's go to our controller and write the toInit method. So this will automatically be evaluated once the component is loaded, right? And I'll be calling a server side action from here, right? So let's do that. Yeah, so now our code is ready, and let's just write a simple console log to check whatever is returned from the server side, right? So I'll just say response dot get return value, and this will normally return an object. So let me just add a string here and also stringify this success scenario, and I'll just stringify this response so that we can see actually what's been returned. Let's click on save now. All right, let me just check what's the issue. Parsing error, unexpected token, semicolon. So this is closed, this is closed. There should be one more bracket, right? Let's click on save now. Yeah, so this is saved. Now let's go to our component and try to preview it. Our application rather, not component. Let's try to preview this. And now we should have a console log automatically coming up. I'll just open up the JavaScript console and let's see. So you see, I'm getting success scenario, check is equal to false and name is equal to SF training. That means whatever we populated on the default wrapper, the name and the checkbox fields, the Boolean value fields are coming up fine and are showing up on the client side controller, right? But now let's do some tweaks and changes. So if I go to my controller and just remove the aura enabled annotation from here, this is our use case, right? Now that I do it, I remove the aura enabled annotation. Will we be able to see the name value? Will we be able to see the check value? Let's check that. Let's go to our app and update the preview. So you see, I'm just seeing the name value here, right? Which means aura enabled is a must whenever you want to get some values from the server side to the client side. So without the aura enabled annotation, you cannot access them at all, be it on the UI or in the JavaScript controller. All right, super cool. Let's move on to the next question.